So one of the topics we're going to talk about just to get started here, and I've just put some scratch on the board back here. It's really for me just to kind of remind me of what to say. But one of the big concepts we're going to pay attention to is what is the bare minimum documentation that's needed to have what we would call a high value case, a good case. What's the bare minimum? What are the categories? What is this? This is what we're going to be paying attention to. So do we have the mechanism of injury? So everything starts with the mechanism of injury, period. Okay. That's cause and effect relationship. Number two, do we have subjective findings at MMI? Do we have hybrid findings, evidence at MMI? Do we have objective evidence at MMI? Now you notice I said a couple words here. I said hybrid. A lot of times when I talk, a lot of people don't understand the word hybrid. So subject obviously is the patient on their own. Hybrid is a combination of the patient's action and the doctor's interpretation. Objective is totally independent of the patient. So these three categories become very important to have documentation in each one of these categories. And the type of documentation that we look for, in other words, we look for meaningful documentation. What does that mean? Primary versus secondary documentation. So we want to make sure, if it's a high value case, we have all these categories, but we have what's called primary documentation. In other words, it's directly related to that category and that injury. That's a simple way to think of it. As opposed to secondary, not necessarily directly related, but it's supportive. So, having said that, these three categories right here, subjective, hybrid, and objective, we obviously need all three. We need a bare minimum of a primary in each one of these. But this case grows as we add multiple primaries. So we can have 2 or 3 primaries. We can have 3 or 4 primaries. And then we can have 2 or 3 primaries, and then we can have 2, 3, or 4, or 5, 6 secondaries. See? And as that increases, so the first objective is have all the documentation in the first 7 categories fulfilled first with primary. Now, that's the absolute, when I talk to my attorneys, I said, that's the absolute sign that you have a case value, a good case value. In other words, that's good enough to go to court right there. We've got everything we need to go to court right there. We got a high value case. Now, number 5 category has the patient reached MMI, maximum medical improvement. Number 6, was there an impairment? Number 7, is there a prognosis and need for future care? These are the 7 categories. So when I worked with my attorneys and I had all the documentation, I would tell my attorneys, said, you don't have a very good case. Well, what's that based on? It's based on this. And in other words, if I said you don't have a very good case, it's because they didn't have 1 or 2 of these categories fulfilled with primary documentation. And then if I said you got a good case, if you want to go to court with that, you're good to go. We've got you. And it's because we had all 7 of these categories, and we had at least as a bare minimum a primary finding in the subjective, a primary finding in the hybrid, and a minimum primary finding in the objective.